We've heard tons of information going around about inflation in the United States, and it seems like the prices are just continuing to rise. Now that inflation has reached a 40-year high, many Americans are wondering if it's even possible for prices to decrease anytime soon. Here with me to discuss this is Stephen Barnes. He's a professor of economics and also the director of the Kathleen Blanco Public Policy Center. Thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
All right, so let's get into it. So first, let's start with the basics about, what is inflation, and also how do you even get to a state of inflation?
Sure. Inflation is what we call a pattern of rising prices. And so specifically, when you go to the store week after week and you look at the same exact items on the shelf, when those prices start to go up over time, that's what we call inflation.
So obviously the pandemic had something to do with this. How does that tie into the increased prices we're seeing now?
Sure. The economy we often think of as being a very flexible and dynamic environment, but the reality is it takes time for businesses and workers, the people that are running these businesses, to adjust and make changes. And the pandemic brought some of the fastest and largest changes that we have seen impacting the economy in generations. And it's just taken the economy some time to adapt and adjust to that.
And some of those changes have to do with people's buying patterns. Maybe they were buying a different type of product, and how does that change? How does that affect inflation?
Absolutely. So in the earliest days of the pandemic, we saw huge changes in consumer behavior as large parts of the economy were entirely shut down. So people shifted from consuming food at restaurants to purchasing food from the grocery store to consume at home. And vacations were canceled and people spent money on home improvements and different categories of spending. And with those big changes in consumer behavior, that started to put a lot of pressure on the supply for goods that people hadn't really been consuming quite at that level. Now that we're coming out of that pandemic environment, it's not fully behind us, but we're really moving back into a more normalized environment. We're seeing the pendulum swing back with people shifting again towards a lot of things that they used to buy. And with that big push in consumer demand, very often the supplies can't keep up, and that's when we'll see that upward pressure on prices that ultimately leads to inflation.
Okay, so really it's consumer driven.
It's largely consumer driven. Now, prices are always about supply and demand. And so we have seen some big changes in supply as well. We can think about a lot of the disruptions that we saw and heard about during the pandemic, with companies having to shut down because of virus cases within their workforce. And so when you start to have disruptions like that throughout the economy, over time those things accumulate and make it harder for us to get raw commodities, basic products like steel and iron, all the way through to finished products like vehicles and cars. And so over these last couple of years, we've seen those disruptions anywhere up and down that supply chain ultimately slow down how quickly companies can get those supplies to market. And that's also helped to contribute to this shortage, so to speak, or this difference between high demand and shortcomings on the supply side, which also can contribute to higher prices and inflation.
Well, Americans have definitely seen inflation before. Like I said earlier, this is a 40-year high. Is there a way to predict when it'll end?
Well, we'll never be certain until we start to see that curve change. But one of the other factors that we know has helped to prop up high demand for these products is some additional savings that people built up and the additional federal support people got during the pandemic. And people are really using up that one-time money and getting back into a place where they're going to have to be a little more responsive to those high prices. What that means is we no longer have savings to draw from. We're going to have to slow down our consumption, purchase a little bit less. That's going to decrease demand and help us cool off that price inflation.
All right, and so just, in the meantime, is there anything people should know about inflation and just how to weather the storm?
Well, it's not fun for anybody, and I think the good news is it's not going to last forever. We really don't expect it to last all that much longer. A lot of the data we're looking at does suggest that we might be at a high point now and that things may start to cool off even as soon as the end of this year. So hang in there, but be careful with that, with your purchases, and as we all do that collectively and start to pull back a little bit and be a little more selective in what we're buying, that's going to help also to slow down that price inflation and get us back into a more normalized environment.
All right, so thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. Again, Stephen is the director of the Kathleen Blanco Public Policy Center, and he's also a professor of economics. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.